slight emergency? You don't mean it. There's only one man to cope with it. Find
Zig and Zag. So atomic demolition munitions.
This weapon, what is it exactly?
It's a miniature atomic bomb. That's what it is.
Yeah, well, that's essentially correct. Small, clean nuclear device.
What about radiation fallout?
Oh, 60 feet, minimal.
Hello, my name is Heinz Pommer. I am a graduate physicist, and I work as a technical writer and illustrator. The title of my presentation today is, Neither Fire Nor Explosives. How was it possible that Pasquale Boselli survived the demolition of the North Tower? The link to the slides is given below. And I would also like to say a big thank you that this lecture can be held here, in Moscow, today. Now, your first question will be, who is this Pasquale Boselli? Mr. Boselli is kind of the key witness to the Twin Towers demolition process. 15 people survived the demolition in the North Tower. But only Pasquale Boselli was relatively high up in the building, about 80 meters above street level. He was able to give an eyewitness account of the events inside the tower and how the tower disintegrated. And I would like to explain why he survived the process. Here is a short video to introduce the topic with Mr. Boselli's statement. Quote, "And as I was praying, the wall cracked and the floor gave way, and that's when I started to freefall and I realized at that point, my God, this is how I am going to die."
And as I was praying, the wall cracked and the floor gave way. And that's when I started to free fall, and I realized at that point, oh my God, this is how I'm going to die.
The falling fountain of material can be seen well. After the shot through the building, the vertical segments now fall in a rotating movement on the left side. Watch, here on the left they appear from the dust. Afterwards you see the still remaining structure collapsing vertically on the right. This structure has been nicknamed the spire. So let's summarize the first slide, its topic. Who is this Pasquale Boselli? We now have to leave the old discussions framework, fire or explosives. Because usually this question already has you trapped and you cannot find the truth, if it was neither fire and dead weight, nor explosives. Specifically, I would like to clarify two things with this lecture by describing the physical processes. First, the Western globally valid narrative, 3 towers collapsed due to fire, is a clearly recognizable lie that strangely enough has been globally accepted. Second, alternative media, especially the group of architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth, are deceived. It was not a blast, with explosives, at least not in the conventional sense. The Twin Towers were destroyed by a different process, namely by the eruption of focused working gases from the ground. And similarly to the COVID crime, the precisely planned sequence of events testifies to incredible technical expertise. This lecture is primarily focusing on explaining the dynamics, based on the observed processes that occurred on site, explaining them one after the other. Once these processes are started, they run predictably and automatically within 30 seconds, like a marble on the Devil's Marble Run. So slide 2 is, leaving the discussion frame. But how do we leave it? How do we escape it? For this let us now analyze the destruction dynamics of the South Tower. First the top block began to sink down and at the same time rotate slightly. Then it suddenly stopped in its rotating movement and dissolved completely in the upper part, disappearing in the dust. This dust was dark black at the top due to vaporized iron and grey-white at the bottom due to the pulverized concrete. It was two-layered, two-colored. So this slide is, there was a two-colored dust and the twisting moment torque of the sinking top block disappeared. Further, you could observe a distinct front of destruction making its way from top to bottom on the outer facade of the building, some kind of pressure wave. This wandering front of destruction with some single outbursts, or squibs, here and there is generally misinterpreted as evidence for synchronized detonation of many thousands of individual explosive charges. But we have a continuous process here. The segments from a tower built of individual segments tear apart individually, one by one, and delayed, as they resist, one by one. You can see it in this video. First the tower buckles, and then the overpressure is released and the pressure wave travels downwards. So, we summarize for slide 4, a pressure wave, traveling down, was observed on the facade. Now we come to the destruction dynamics of the North Tower. A wall of flames briefly emerged from the hole in the North Tower before the top block on the firmly standing tower sank down and dissolved. So a wall of flames, put briefly for this slide. It was seconds afterwards that the entire tower spew out its components fountain-like, as can be seen here, and was torn open at the side. So, this slide, fountain formation. However, if we look at a detailed section under the magnifying glass, it looks like this. The tower is cut open on the side as with a knife, while a fountain of debris has already started to fall down from above in a parabolic shape. If you happen to be inside something like this, it is impossible to survive. And yet this happened, the hitherto inexplicable miracle of Stairwell B. So, for slide 7, remember the cutting effect. The destruction dynamics of Building 7 was clearly different. Building 7 produced deep black smoke for hours until its sudden collapse in the late afternoon. Only seconds before freefall, the upper structure, the so-called penthouse, collapsed and light started flooding through the glass window panes from above. It was seconds afterwards that the entire building collapsed, unexpectedly and suddenly, with no resistance from the inner vertical steel columns and outer facade. In other words, any load-bearing structure had suddenly been dissolved. Then a mushroom cloud developed and rose into the sky, more than 1.5 kilometers high. Here is a short video of the collapse.
Watching all day. This is like watching the collapse of an active volcano, and the dust from it is not unlike that from a volcano.
And that eventually would either come down on its own or it would be taken down. I would imagine it came down on its own.
The height of the mushroom cloud can be easily estimated by the 4 buildings of the World Financial Center. These buildings, on the right, are approximately 200 meters high. So, slide 8, the mushroom cloud over Building 7. But today we are focusing on the events in the North Tower, Tower A, WTC-1. This is the tower with the antenna on the roof. We have particular interest in the 22nd floor. Pasquale Bazzelli was there when the destruction hit. We know from the cross-section of the blueprints, the tower had a square floor plan, 64 meters by 64 meters. The outer facade was a steel grid which at the same time had a load-bearing function. The inner core had a rectangular shape housing the elevator shafts, the service units and the stairwells. Office spaces were spacious and open, situated between the core and this outer facade. Of particular importance to us is the central elevator shaft of the freight elevator 50. You see it here, this small yellow square in the center, and the green stairwell B on the right. There were 3 stairwells in total, but only stairwell B is of interest to us. Our key witness was exactly there, at 0 time. So this slide made us familiar with the 22nd floor. A side view of the general blueprint shows us the twin towers, and I would like to emphasize some features here. 1. In the blueprints, the architectural zero point of reference is 75 meters deep in the granite. From this zero-point view, the tower is 510 meters high. The 400 meters apply from street level. 2. The central elevator shaft number 50 in the middle, yellow, is 420 meters continuous from bottom to top, because it also goes through the 4 basement floors. This is the most important technical element of the whole lecture. This elevator shaft defines the eruption channel through the entire tower. That is very, very important. 3. For this central freight elevator 50, there is an additional deepening in the granite, the so-called elevator pit. It is about 6 meters deep. This deepening also acts as a nozzle. Keep in mind, the elevator shaft went from the bottom to the top as an eruption channel. 4. Furthermore, the rectangular inner structure, the inner core, is shown in red. The central core is subelement 1 of the structural system, design element A. 5. Subelement 2 of the structural system is the outer steel grid, design element B. It had been built much more solid than a normal facade. About 100,000 tons of steel and 400,000 tons of glass and concrete had been used to build each tower. So the total weight of the tower is 500,000 tons each. So, for slide 10 we remember the eruption channel, 510 meters high, starting at 0 point. Now we come to the actual destruction process. About 10 seconds before the visible destruction of the twin towers set in, a seismic tremor was registered each. There were 3 earth tremors in total, not 2. The 2 strong seismic signals can be clearly assigned to the twin towers. The third earth tremor, shown in green, much smaller, cannot be clearly attributed to Building 7, as it was not followed by destruction, but only by the development of black smoke from around 11 AM onwards. But let's go back to the North Tower. The quake under the North Tower had a magnitude of 2.3 on Richter scale. Then it was quiet for about 10 seconds. We remember for slide 11, the earthquake. However, 21 seconds after the earthquake, the North Tower looked exactly like this, a standing, exuberant fountain of rubble and dust, and centrally above it a black cloud of smoke. That's what I call a shot right through the whole building. So, what about the short time span between the quake and these quiet 10 seconds? Something very mysterious must have happened. In summary, you can already conclude so far. 1. The observed demolition dynamics is atypical for fire, kerosene, and dead weight. 2. It is also atypical for cutting charges and explosive charges such as thermite or TNT. This raises the question, so what? We need a new solution approach. It cannot have been neither explanatory approach number 1 nor explanatory approach number 2, because both contradict the observations. Now, the ground zero model, the GZM, assumes a high energy input directly under the towers, namely at the referenced architectural zero point. That is 75 meters deep in the granite. Let us first assume a purely chemical process and estimate 50 trucks, each carrying 20 tons of some substance X. This is equivalent to the energy of more than 1 kiloton of TNT. And that is very, very much. So, think of 50 trucks in the parking lot of a German highway at the weekend, each with 20 tons of cargo. If this energy is freed, converted into heat and pressure, it must somehow form an eruptive egg under the tower, whose erupting working gases shoot upwards through the tower via the freight elevator 50. But the question remains, why do these working gases have such a destructive effect if they initially only shoot upwards through a very narrow channel in the granite? How is that possible? So, slide 13 reads, the ground zero model. Let's now first ask about the physical basic principle of destruction. What happens to a building if a gas pressure chamber with very hot working gases discharges eruptively through a narrow shaft in the building? Let's do consideration 1. According to the Bernoulli principle, by the way, Bernoulli was a Swiss physicist. Greetings to Switzerland. According to the Bernoulli principle, there is negative pressure with a suction effect in the direct vicinity of the flow. You also see this in an express train speeding past. The airflow can carry away objects and pull them towards the train. Here in the tower, the breakout occurs at the moment when the negative pressure collapses, for example due to the height of climb reached or alternatively through an opening with obstacles in it. So, to summarize slide 14, suction effect and negative pressure. Or, as a consequence of this, after the eruption of the plasma, after the eruption of the hot gases, consideration 2. If these working gases are extremely hot, they immediately destroy the building structure when they break out in the upper area. We are talking about 4,000 degrees, 5,000 degrees. This dissolved structure then has a high weight and will exert pressure downwards. It will fall downwards. This mass now represents an obstacle for the gas flow that is shooting upwards. When you assume only 10% of the building's weight, that is 50,000 tons of falling mass or a pyroclastic flow that is accelerating from above. So once again, 50,000 tons of hot dust coming down from above and an extremely hot flow of working gases meeting this dust. Hammer and anvil, so to speak, then moving downwards together. Pasquale Bazzelli is in the North Tower in this very situation, symbolically in the yellow box here in the picture. So, we remember for slide 15, hammer and anvil. It is clear already, the inner core of the tower is completely dismantled. But what happens to the outer facade, to the steel grid? We observed a moving front of destruction with the South Tower and more of a cutting knife or tearing open of the North Tower. Both patterns of demolition are clearly logical, because the initially purely vertical directions of the working gases that are shooting upwards are deflected horizontally and thus they hit the outer facade with full force. In the case of the North Tower, the gas stream shooting up was significantly faster, more massive and more energetic than with the South Tower. Therefore you have the different behavior, which however is based on the same principle. A quick animation for the South Tower. Material shoots up from below, the obstacle is at the top. The pressure must then be released to the side. So, slide 16 casually put, the pressure simply has to escape. With regard to the outer facade, we can already estimate that the gas flow must hit horizontally from the inside at a speed of at least 100 meters per second. Because the towers were designed for wind speeds of up to 300 kilometers per hour. That is 85 meters per second. A further thermal weakening is of advantage of course to ensure that the entire facade is truly torn apart. In the upper area, the natural expansion of the plasma, the hot gases during the eruption, are sufficient to do so. In the lower area, on the other hand, the speed of the gas flow is significantly higher, as it has to overcome less height while shooting up, and so it still has a high kinetic energy and can act much more destructively. This nice drawing shows all three towers, Building 7, WTC-1 and WTC-2. We remain in the same perspective 712. Slide 17 before the event, everything is still intact. And slide 18, the aftermath. Here the same view after the end of the process 712. Building 7 is a pile of rubble now with its own granite facade lying on top like a red blanket. The site around WTC-1 and WTC-2 is a mere field of rubble. The outer facade is gaped outwards and lies partly like the peels of a peeled banana, with the indicated floor plan of the respective tower in the center. Remarkable here, the upright L-shaped residual structures of the outer facade, always at the end of the arrow, 2 for the South Tower, and 1 for the North Tower. If we extend the end of arrow 1 a bit, you can see a sort of a small dome, a white pile of rubble, in the middle of the floor plan of the North Tower. We now zoom into the picture. It is the same picture. We recognize a single protruding column to the right of the dome. Remember that column. The remaining L-shaped structure of the facade is also clearly visible, a long and a short segment. You saw this with the North Tower, and the South Tower had standing structures left with exactly this shape. And here a photo from the ground, the dome made of rubble and the single protruding column we remembered. So we remember from slides 18 to 20, remaining structures. At this point we deviate a little from the happenings on the ground to show something in a home experiment. Because as physicist Richard Feynman said so well, it doesn't make any difference how smart you are, who made the guess, or what his name is. If it disagrees with experiment, it's wrong. That's all there is to it. So, first we show that a little tower made of aluminum square tube segments disintegrates from top to bottom if a focused stream of air shoots through it from below. In this experiment with approximate 6 bar from an air compressor nozzle. So here is the first experiment. One segment after the other is lifted off at the top, as the protective vacuum in the pipe no longer exists and the airflow can expand at the top. Empty matchboxes standing next to the tower also feel the expanding airflow at the top, tipping to the side or being whirled around. It is important to keep in mind, one segment after the other is lifted off at the top, piece by piece, when you have an airflow from below. The destruction does not start at the bottom, as is always assumed. So, slide 21 was top-down destruction, from top to bottom. Our home experiment can stably be reproduced. In another setup too, an airflow also dismantles a tower made of aluminum square tube segments from top to bottom, shown here on the left side. Second experiment. We see it again, the destruction wave is moving downwards. However, if we add a cladding, as shown on the right, an outer facade, in our case metal plates fixed with magnetic tape, we observe the horizontal component is too weak to propel the metal plates sideways. The lateral expansion of the air is not sufficient for this. Only the aluminum tube segments are whirled around in the tower like in a whirlpool. I hold one of these metal plates into the camera, here. I don't know if you can see that, but the contours of the system truss elements are printed on it. So, here is the third experiment. The energy is not enough to propel these metal plates sideways. So this slide may receive the headline, metal plates or, more elegantly, truss system elements of the facade. That would be the correct technical term. However, as soon as we place a counter mass on the eruption shaft, for example a small bucket, this mass is briefly lifted by the upward moving flow of air. Underneath, the shaft of aluminum segments is destroyed. The mass now starts to fall while horizontally deflecting the airflow that continues to shoot upwards. The metal plates, which are fastened with magnetic tape, are now actually successfully blown away sideways by the airflow, from top to bottom. So here is the fourth and final experiment. Directly at the nozzle, the bucket is stopped again and catapulted upwards, which is of course nonsense for imitating the processes at the World Trade Center. But you understood the principle. With the help of components from 3D printers, this model can certainly be much better and convincingly be represented. That would be a worthwhile research paper at a brave university or even a school. By the way, a student already created a CAD model for me that can be printed on 3D printers. It consists of loosely attached Lego bricks in combination with the printed parts. Of course, everything must be set up so loosely that the small pressure differences actually dismantle the model. Unfortunately, this is very, very time-consuming and has therefore not yet been realized. So far for the building blocks. But let's go back to our little dome. In media reports you find the story under The Miracle of Stairwell B. Inside the small dome, Mickey Cross group of 14 people survived, and Pasquale Bazzelli survived a free fall of 50 meters and landed on or behind the small dome. So we can summarize slide 25, The Miracle of Stairwell B. After the debris had been cleared, it looked like this behind this dome. The stairwell in which the group survived with Mickey Cross is clearly visible here. It's a little miracle. But as the structures are intact, so the people in them survived also. It is a miracle, but somewhat logical. You and I would have survived too. Pasquale Bazzelli's story, on the other hand, borders on magic. The tower disintegrated beneath him and he free fell 50 meters downwards. He was not killed by the impact, but softly set down. He was neither slain, nor crushed by the debris, nor torn apart by explosives, nor burned by thermite or fire, nor irradiated or boiled, nor vaporized. He neither went deaf nor blind. However, he reported a roaring noise during his 50-meter fall. Then the tower had disappeared and above him was blue sky. So, in summary, slide 26, magic, the hitherto inexplicable. Pasquale Bazzelli's statements are so interesting to me because they coincide with all the phenomena to be expected according to the Ground Zero model. They do not coincide with the explanations that state explosives and cutting agents as the main cause. In his book We All Fall Down, he describes the stages before and during the destruction. And pay attention, it's always areas of seconds he talks of in his narrative. It's not milliseconds, as you would expect from a blast. Everything is slow, like in a nightmare. First the tower trembles. Bazzelli writes, a growing shiver. Then the tower begins to shake like a madman. He writes, a shaking machine. A roaring noise follows from above. Only then does the stairwell connection break and the railings are torn out of the wall. Now cracks are starting to form in the wall. And these cracks are growing slowly. Bazzelli writes, a growing crack. Suddenly all the supporting structures give way and the stairwell sags and everything is filled with dust. For the next few seconds, Bazzelli tumbles downwards and is hit by hard objects that are whirling around. However, he is partly carried and slowed down by the strong updrafts. He writes, gusts of hellish breath, his body turning and twisting on a terrible wind. After the fall, there is a soft touchdown on a steel girder at the height of the 4th floor after several seconds of flight. Bazzelli only suffers a broken leg when he touches down. So we might very well nickname slide 27, the nightmare. And it is a nightmare when you're in a building and suddenly everything starts to disintegrate. Pasquale Bazzelli's book is written in a very emotional, somewhat inflated and sometimes even tearful way. In the context of a cold, sober analysis, however, we have to ask, where was who? In other words, precise position data, pressures, speeds, times, etc. The book is nevertheless an important element for 9/11 research, the book of the key witness. When the working gases shot up, Pasquale Bazzelli was on the 22nd floor. The group with Mickey Cross on the 4th floor. But both in stairwell B. The working gases shoot up at a rate of at least 100 meters per second. and probably even 200 meters per second in the initial phase, as can be deduced from the interference signals, the blackouts, from the live transmission from the helicopter, the WCBS news chopper. But let's go back to the question, where was who? On what floor? What happened? The cross-shaped corridors act at this moment as negative pressure distributors and later as positive pressure distributors. Material is thus pulled into the center by the suction. In the stairwell, the concrete structures break, but not yet the steel columns. So far only the cracking and subsidence of the stairs and walls is taking place. So slide 28 is the pressure distributor, the corridors. Then slide 29, the negative pressure. Here the situation of Pasquale-Bazzelli, working gases are already shooting up before the tower is visibly destroyed. Everything still goes on inside. Here it becomes particularly clear that the central elevator shaft number 50 is slightly offset to the west. It is not central. In the very center of the building are the cross-shaped corridors. Freight elevator 50 is next to them. As I said, material is now being pulled into the center by the suction, especially through the corridors. This special geometry, the offset of the eruption channel, saves the lives of a few people in the tower and is responsible for the creation of the residual structures of the small dome and the L-shaped residual structures of the facade. Slide 30. Now comes the overpressure. A few seconds later, the overpressure zone moves through the 22nd floor. But at this point, Pasquale-Bazzelli is already below the deadly funnel. The material is ejected in all directions, but especially to the west. In the final phase, the material is ejected beyond the small dome. I have marked Pasquale-Bazzelli's landing point with a small square in cyan color. It is located in the immediate vicinity of stairwell B, on the right. You can see that Bazzelli drifted only a few meters to the southeast. Here again is a close-up view of the situation when the pressure zone passes through the tower. The photographer is looking south and the west side of the tower is clearly visible, exactly that direction in which the freight elevator 50 had its offset. In this direction, the cutting effect was stronger because the facade was closer to the energy flow. This slight asymmetry in the eruption behavior, or eruption pattern, is explained by the ground zero model, and only by the ground zero model. No other model does. And again the question, where was who? This time when the structure was destroyed. In the picture I have marked the parabola of the fountain and the extreme ejection of material to the west with grey dots. Pasquale-Bazzelli and the group with Mickey Cross are in the opposite part of the tower, that is, eastwards. Inner steel columns are already dismantled and torn apart as the pressure zone passes through. The steel lattice structure of the outer facade, however, is destroyed segment by segment, or in some parts it breaks as a whole to the outside. But the stairwell and the concrete walls have already sunk downwards, inside the tower. And together with this debris, Bazzelli falls downwards. So Pasquale-Bazzelli is always below the pressure zone. The free fall is slowed down by the updrafts. The assumed fall speed is 10 meters per second. That is 36 kilometers per hour. And so the fall time for the 50 meters is a full 5 seconds. So this slide 32 can be named the 9/11 surfer. This is what Pasquale-Bazzelli is sometimes called because of the relatively long duration of falling or floating on the updraft winds. Pasquale-Bazzelli's key message is the slow cracking of the walls that he describes, the loosening of the joints and the seconds-long process of falling. Otherwise, he himself is the living proof of the event, the effect of the negative pressure in the vicinity of the upshooting working gases, the constant deceleration of the fall. Here is the interview in English, an excerpt from it.
And as I was praying the the wall cracked and the floor gave way. And that's when I started to free fall, and I realized at that point, oh my God, this is how I'm going to die. I prayed for a quick death, and I stayed tucked in to a fetal position. I felt this sandblast or abrasive kind of air. I was getting hit, impacts. I saw flashes of light from the impacts. You know, if you ever get hit with a baseball or something, or punch or something, you see that flash. So I guess from the impacts of falling, I saw several flashes of light and then one bright flash. And a split second later, I opened up my eyes, and I was just sitting there, totally numb, looking up at blue sky.
The key message of Mickey Cross is the described suction effect. Quote, "And then the wind. A very, very fierce wind." Here is the excerpt from the interview in English.
And then the wind, a very, very fierce wind, and my helmet, it started lifting me up off the ground, and so that's when I crouched down. The next thing I just crouched down. I got to the corner of the staircase by the railing, and I just got as small as I could possibly get. My helmet started flying off my head. I had forgotten to snap my helmet, so I grabbed my helmet. I guess instinctually I just pulled myself down into the corner.
So, for slide 34 we remember, the wind in the tower. The entire dynamics of destruction, including the miracles, can be explained simply and without contradiction, assuming focused working gases erupting from the ground. There is no longer any reason for the alternative media to oppose this physically correct approach, except for the fear of the readers. Except for people's fear that this explanation could be true, and their refusal to address the issue. With COVID, this rejection is not so strong, as the possibility of an error on the part of those responsible always provides a psychological loophole. The intuitive excuse, the politicians didn't mean it, they didn't want it, didn't know about it. To help overcome this fear, I have designed various objects that can serve as a starting point for a conversation that can be helpful. These are cups, game cubes, booklets, and so on. For example, here is a booklet, Physics, Fear and Fun, which explains the physics of the vertical throw based on the chosen height of the North Tower. It's a joke, a physicist's joke hidden in the blueprints. In addition, very interesting footage is shown in comparison with other big explosions. In summary, this booklet compares the energies and forces of already known explosions and deduces playfully that only very high energies underground can explain the observed destruction pattern. As seen on 9/11 at the North Tower, at the South Tower and at Building 7. So, slide 35 in summary, dealing with the attitude of rejection. Furthermore, the main physical question marks concerning the destruction of the World Trade Center can be playfully reduced to just 6 questions and can thus be represented on the faces of a Rubik's Cube. I will show this briefly. These 6 topics are: 1. Impulse, that is, the dust fountain of the North Tower with the side surface momentum. 2. The energy underground, that is, the observed cooling time of 3 months. This side shows the rising steam clouds in front of the remains. 3. Next, the non-preserved angular momentum of the South Tower that we discussed, so this side surface is named non-conservation of angular momentum. 4. The survivors in the North Tower that we discussed, survivors would be topic of this side. 5. The flaring up of cars that were suddenly on fire, so, side surface sudden fires, and 6. The hot dust, namely the pyroclastic flow and mushroom cloud above Building 7 that rose into the sky in the late afternoon. So, for this side, hot dust. So that's slide 36, the Rubik's Cube. There are of course many more mysteries surrounding September 11th. Consequently, I illustrated another type of cube and realized that almost all of the mysteries surrounding the destruction of the World Trade Center can actually be reduced to just 42 questions. This allows them to be represented in a shape-changing cube, as shown here. This here has been a cube with different sides, which can take on very interesting shapes. And here is a closed cube, and it can be opened and contains further puzzles. These are the known outer surfaces, but if we open it, you have, for example, the mystery about the outpouring liquid metal or the seismic signals. You can play with this cube, and every single picture is a mystery that can well be explained. Everything fits together harmoniously if you only know how to fold the cube back together again. So you can learn a lot of details by playing such dice games. And yet, besides all games, in psychological terms, the subject remains very difficult to access. Let me quote Dr. David Hughes from the University of Lincoln. Entertaining the possibility that 9/11 was a false flag requires Westerners to reject fundamental assumptions that they have been socialized to accept since birth. But what exactly does psychologically difficult to access mean? This means that people become indifferent or get angry, run out of the room because they can no longer grasp the information. Because they feel attacked in their view of understanding the world. I'll come back to that. So we nickname slide 37, the ability to change. So, in this lecture here, in a first and cautious step, we try to allow at least the thought of a possible eruption at all. To allow the thought at all. The nature of the energy input is initially of secondary importance. As an example, I have mentioned 50 times 20 tons of a substance X, which leads to the formation of the gas pressure chamber. However, the use of few bags of substance U is also conceivable, approximately 120 kilograms. This is much less. However, this would make the process nuclear rather than chemical. A test drilling would prove the nature of the energy input beyond doubt and end all disputes. In any case, the process can be easily synchronized with the historical videos in an animated cartoon film. For this nuclear process, I created 120 individual images for the South Tower. This means we can see into or through the tower, so to speak. Here is the short clip. The activated liquid element mixture burns into the granite as a delayed supercritical reactor system at approximate 3000 degrees and ignites at 0 point. Within 10 seconds, the erupting egg burns its way upwards. An eruption occurs, which initially shoots through the tower in a focused manner. The top of the tower disintegrates, sags, and begins to rotate. Evaporated iron is recognizable as black dust, concrete powder is white. The tower is pulverized from top to bottom. So we have slide 38. The important message here is, from conventional approach to nuclear, going nuclear. We can see therefore that the processes defined by the ground zero model can already be vividly explained in a rough home experiment, namely the dynamics. And we can see that all the observations on site fit perfectly into the model or are even supported by it, thanks to the available videos. Nevertheless, the ground zero model is to this day largely being rejected or ignored by alternative media, the AM. This psychological phenomenon is based on the unimaginable scale of the crime, on propagandistic counter-narratives such as the NIST report, on controlled universities and bought scientists, complicity, and the impact that well-intentioned dissenting voices and arguments have against the ground zero model, including coming from alternative media. In the latter case, the two main arguments are: 1. There was no significant radioactive contamination, and 2. keeping such a crime secret is not possible. After all, you can't plan and carry out something like this without someone indicating this or warning the public. However, AI, artificial intelligence, writes something completely different in this context. So here we see some new kind of development, a sort of struggle between the role of alternative media and the role of AI in solving this crime. AM versus AI. Let me first come back to the argument, it is impossible because of lacking contamination. If, for example, we ask AI concerning the realization of such a process, ChatGPT writes, "Here you go. Here you have a hypothetical composition of matter for a nuclear demolition system based on a delayed supercritical reactor system." The recipe is slightly grayed out in the slide, because the important thing here is the binding, or masking, of the fallout. And about this fallout binding ChatGPT writes, first, the initial radiation consists of gamma and neutron radiation. Second, the residual radiation, alpha and beta radiation from the fission products of uranium, is bound in the debris dust. And third, the fallout binding is generally high due to the inclusion of the material in the evaporation core, where the process started in the granite. In short, ChatGPT writes, yes, it is possible. So, in summary, I now address all peace and truth researchers. Please check the arguments regarding the statement, there was no significant contamination. Contamination was slightly elevated at ground zero. That is a fact. However, this fact has so far been consistently swept under the carpet, meaning argued away. The numerous cancer cases among first responders also point to low-level, long-term radiation exposure in addition to the effects of asbestos and toxic fumes. So, this important slide 40 was the fallout binding explained by AI. Thinking about the second argument, it is not possible to keep such a crime secret. There is no need to refer to the top-secret Manhattan Project around 1942, which led to the development of the atomic bomb. Because the development of the narrative, regarding the destruction of the World Trade Center through a nuclear process, actually runs like a main theme through September 11th history. The atomic bomb narrative was originally intentional. It is clearly there. Here are some examples. In 1990, a card game predicts the destruction of a twin tower by a nuclear bomb. The card was actually called Terrorist Nuke. In 1995, Benjamin Netanyahu warns in his book Fighting Terrorism that the WTC could be destroyed by a nuclear bomb detonated by Islamists. In 1998, the U.S. strategy paper, Foreign Affairs, Volume 77, Number 6, co-authored by Philip D. Zelikow, takes up the subject as a cautionary example. Quote here, "If the bomb that exploded under the World Trade Center in 1993 had been nuclear, or had effectively spread a deadly pathogen, then all the drastic measures are listed that the government would have to make use of to protect its citizens." 5 days after the event on September 16, 2001, an article appeared in the Spanish newspaper El Mundo, stating that 3 mini-nuclear bombs had been purchased on the black market by the suspected terrorist group, even specifying the type. To summarize briefly, now addressing all peace and truth researchers. Please check the arguments regarding the statement, there was never any evidence of the possible use of a nuclear bomb in the destruction of the World Trade Center. It is a fact that the narrative was systematically prepared, but then dropped in favor of a soft version. So the breathtaking slide 41 might carry the title, Pre-Knowledge and Narrative Development. And the last slide, how do we finally get out of this mess? Let us have the courage to overcome the narrative psychologically, playfully, with the use of AI systems that allow us to bypass filters of political correctness and provide answers uninfluenced by cultural influences or preferences. But besides courage and AI systems, besides networking and a slow collective awakening, we need help. For people have been and continue to be deceived at every level. This also applies to many accomplices who are simply victims of an incredible fraud concept that they themselves do not understand. In short, overcoming the deception requires everyone's help, especially the help of those who are unwilling offenders in this game and want to drop out. Not only do we have to learn being brave and courageous, but also to forgive in order to get out of it, for the sake of truth. The more that we clearly speak out that we have seen through and penetrated the system of lies, the more we keep telling people that there is a future for those who want to drop out, and forgiveness is possible, the faster the house of cards of lies will collapse. I hope this presentation was able to contribute in this regard. Thank you.